buy a KFC franchise, a globally trusted brand, a bucket of chicken every family already craves, lines out the door on a Friday night, cash rolling in on the back of decades of brand equity. Now the real number, the man who ran KFC as its CEO in the 1970s, went on to build his own chicken chain to 350 locations and $300 million in annual sales, and it still collapsed into bankruptcy, selling for just $1.25 million. Here is what this actually costs. Start with the franchise fee itself, $45,000, split into a $20,000 deposit and a $25,000 option fee, non-negotiable and non-refundable if Yum Brands rejects your application after the review process. That fee buys you the right to open, not the restaurant itself. According to KFC's 2025 franchise disclosure document, the total initial investment for a newly constructed location ranges from $1,852,825 to $3,771,550, covering land or lease costs, building construction, kitchen equipment, signage, and opening inventory. A remodel or reopened location runs somewhat less, $1,052,825 to $2,521,550, but still requires 7 figures before day one of operation. Yum Brands also requires franchisees to demonstrate significant liquid capital and typically wants operators committing to 3 to 5 locations, not just one, before approval is even granted. Add legal fees, site selection consulting, and pre-opening training costs, and a realistic all-in number for a single new KFC location clears $2 million before a single piece of chicken is sold to a paying customer. Royalty runs 4 to 5% of gross revenue, or a minimum of $1,440 a month, whichever is greater. A fee owed to Yum Brands, regardless of whether the location turns a profit that month. On top of that, the National Co-op Advertising Fund takes another 4.5 to 5% of gross revenue, meaning roughly 9 to 10% of every dollar in sales leaves the building before a single ingredient is purchased. Food cost runs 28 to 32% of revenue, driven by chicken, breading, oil, and packaging. Labor costs run 25 to 30%, covering kitchen staff, cashiers, and management. Rent or mortgage payments, utilities for constant fryer operation, liability and property insurance, and point-of-sale technology fees stack on top of that. Add it together: royalty, advertising, food, labor, rent, insurance. And a single KFC location is carrying somewhere between 90 and 94% of its gross revenue in direct operating cost, before ownership counts a dollar of profit, a range narrow enough that a single percentage point of cost creep can swing the year's outcome meaningfully. Now the money side. Yum Brands discloses average annual gross revenue per KFC location at roughly $1.4 million to $1.6 million, based on item 19 of the company's own franchise disclosure document. Subtract the 90 to 94% cost stack from Section 2, and net profit for a well-run single location lands between $95,000 and $160,000 a year, a 6 to 10% net margin. On a $2 million plus entry investment, that translates to a 10 to 20-year payback period before the initial capital is even recovered, according to franchise financial analysts who track the system closely. The bucket of chicken selling for $25 is quietly funding one of the tightest margins in retail food service, on top of one of the largest upfront investments in franchising, a combination most first-time buyers don't fully appreciate until the FDD is already signed. That thin margin assumes labor costs stay where they were when the franchise agreement was signed. In California, that assumption broke in a single legislative session. The external variable is minimum wage legislation targeted specifically at fast food chains, and California's Assembly Bill 12028 shows exactly how fast it can compress an already thin margin. Signed into law in September 2023 and taking full effect April 1, 2024, the bill raised the minimum wage for workers at fast food chains with 60 or more locations nationwide from $16 to $20 an hour, a 25% increase, applied to every hour of every shift, all at once, with no phase-in period. Within roughly a year, California's limited service restaurant sector had lost between 14,000 and 22,000 jobs, depending on the estimate and the methodology used, and fast food menu prices in the state rose 14.5% between September 2023 and October 2024, nearly double the 8.2% national average over the same window. Economists at the Cato Institute estimated the law reduced fast food employment in California by roughly 2.7% relative to the rest of the country, even after accounting for other economic factors. This wasn't a slow drift in labor costs a franchisee could plan around and gradually absorb over several years. It was a 25% wage increase that arrived on a single calendar date, hitting the largest line item in the entire operating cost stack all at once, with no transition period to adjust pricing or staffing in advance. To see what happens when a chicken chain runs into cost pressure it can't outrun, look at the one built by the man who used to run KFC itself. In 1991, former Kentucky governor and former KFC CEO John Y. Brown Jr. teamed up with country singer Kenny Rogers to launch Kenny Rogers Roasters, opening its first location in Coral Springs, Florida, built around wood-fired rotisserie chicken as a healthier alternative to the fried chicken Brown himself had helped popularize at his old company. The concept caught on fast, riding both celebrity appeal and genuine differentiation from the deep-fried competition dominating the category at the time. By the mid-1990s, Kenny Rogers Roasters had expanded to more than 350 locations across the US and internationally, generating roughly $300 million in annual sales at its peak, a scale that made it a legitimate national player, not a niche concept. Competition arrived just as quickly. Boston Market built a nearly identical rotisserie concept and scaled it aggressively, and KFC itself, Brown's former company, launched a rotisserie gold product line specifically to compete directly for the same health-conscious customers Kenny Rogers Roasters had captured. Overexpansion strained the balance sheet just as sales growth stalled against that new competition on two fronts at once, and the company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in March 1998. It was sold to Nathan's Famous for just $1.25 million later that year, a fraction of its peak valuation. US locations kept shrinking through the 2000s, down to roughly 90 restaurants, until the very last American Kenny Rogers Roasters in Ontario, California, closed permanently on December 31, 2011. The brand survives today only in Asia under Malaysian ownership, with no US presence at all. This was not a failure of concept, celebrity backing, or industry experience. Brown had run KFC itself. It was structural, a category with thin margins and low differentiation, where a rival's copycat product line and a shifting market can outrun even an operator who wrote the playbook. Here's a cost that never appears on a franchise projection: third-party delivery commissions eating into an order that looked profitable when it was placed. Delivery platforms like DoorDash and Uber Eats typically charge restaurants a commission of 15 to 30% of the order value for access to their driver network and app placement. Picture the transaction. A customer orders a $30 bucket meal through a delivery app. Food cost at 30% already takes $9. A 25% delivery commission takes another $7.50. Combined with the 9 to 10% royalty and advertising fee taken off the top, more than 65% of that single order's value is already gone before labor, packaging, or rent are even counted at all, on an order that shows up in the daily sales report looking identical to a full-margin in-store sale, with no separate flag anywhere marking it as the lower margin transaction it actually is. There's another cost growing faster than any other line item in this system, and it doesn't show up as a monthly bill. It shows up as a mandatory capital demand with almost no notice. That risk is mandatory remodeling and reimagining. Like most major QSR franchisors, Yum Brands periodically requires franchisees to reinvest in kitchen equipment upgrades, dining room redesigns, and new store imaging to stay compliant with current brand standards. And franchise agreements typically make this reinvestment a condition of remaining in the system rather than an optional upgrade. These remodel cycles can run into the hundreds of thousands of dollars per location, arriving on the franchisor's timeline, not the franchisee's cash flow schedule. A franchisee already carrying debt from the original $2 million plus build-out and already operating on a 6 to 10% margin can be required to take on a second major capital expense mid-loan, with non-compliance risking termination of the franchise agreement itself. A single mandated remodel cycle, arriving in the wrong year relative to that franchisee's cash position, is exactly the kind of event that can end an individual location's viability, even while the brand nationally reports strong system-wide numbers to investors and the press. Scale genuinely helps here. A multi-unit operator running 5 or more locations spreads management overhead, negotiates better regional supply pricing, and can absorb one underperforming location using cash flow from the rest of the portfolio, which is exactly why Yum Brands favors multi-unit commitments during the approval process. But scale also concentrates risk, rather than diversifying it in the ways that matter most. Every location in California faces the same AB 1228 style wage law simultaneously. Every location faces the same royalty and ad fund percentage, and a franchisor-mandated remodel cycle can hit an entire multi-unit portfolio at once, rather than one store at a time. At a certain size, a KFC franchisee isn't running individual restaurants anymore. It's running a leveraged real estate and labor cost portfolio that happens to sell fried chicken, exposed to the same state-level and franchisor-level decisions across every single location at the same time, with none of the geographic diversification that would normally cushion a single bad policy decision. Optimistic, a single KFC location generates $1.5 million in annual revenue, in line with system averages. Food cost at 30% takes $450,000. Labor at 27% takes $405,000. Royalty and advertising at 9.5% combined take $142,500. Rent, utilities, and insurance run $180,000. Net profit, roughly $145,000. A solid 9.7% margin, near the top of the disclosed range. Realistic, same location, same year, same customer traffic, and same quality of operations. A California-style minimum wage law raises the labor cost line from 27% to 33% of revenue, adding $90,000 in annual labor cost, echoing AB 1228's real 25% wage jump applied to every scheduled hour. A franchisor-mandated equipment and dining room remodel arrives on schedule, regardless of the franchisee's cash position, requiring $180,000 in capital spending, financed at commercial rates, adding roughly $18,000 in annual debt service, on top of the existing loan. And delivery orders, now a meaningful share of total sales as customer habits shift, carry a blended 20% commission on that portion of revenue, cutting an additional $30,000 from what those same orders would have generated if placed in-store instead. Recalculate, net profit falls from $145,000 to roughly $7,000, a 95% collapse in take-home profit on a location that sold the same amount of chicken to the same number of customers all year, with no change in demand or operational quality. The difference between those two scenarios is one wage law, one mandated remodel, and one delivery commission structure. None of these are exotic disasters. All three happen to someone in this system every year. KFC's brand-level first-year franchise failure rate is famously low, under 1%. But that statistic measures whether the doors stay open, not whether the investment actually pays off. A 10 to 20-year payback period on a $2 million plus entry cost is a very different measure of success. And KFC's own 2024 US sales fell 5.2%, while rivals like Raising Cane's grew 32% in the same year. Proof that brand strength alone doesn't guarantee a franchisee's financial outcome. The documented cause of underperformance across the system is never poor operating skill. Franchisees are trained, monitored, and supported more closely than almost any other small business model. It's structural, a fixed 9 to 10% royalty and ad fee that never shrinks regardless of how a location performs. Labor costs subject to sudden state-level mandates that arrive with no phase-in period, and franchisor-required capital reinvestment on a schedule the franchisee doesn't control and can't defer. 5 habits separate the operators still earning a real return from the ones treading water for 2 decades. They commit to multi-unit ownership from the start, since the entire cost structure favors operators who can spread overhead across several locations. They negotiate delivery platform commissions down through volume agreements rather than accepting the default published rate. They build a dedicated capital reserve specifically earmarked for franchisor-mandated remodels rather than financing them reactively at the worst possible moment. They model labor cost scenarios against potential state and local wage legislation before signing a lease in that jurisdiction, and they treat the 10 to 20-year payback period as the real return on investment metric from day one, rather than judging success by whether the location simply stays open. That bucket of chicken with the line out the door is funding a 6 to 10% margin business that took the man who used to run KFC itself down to a $1.25 million bankruptcy sale when he tried to build a rival version of it, using the same category, the same customer base, and decades more industry experience than any first-time franchisee will ever have. The brand recognition was never the risk in this business. The risk was always whether the 90% plus cost stack underneath that recognizable name could survive one bad wage law, one mandated remodel, or one bad year. The same math that beat an actual former KFC CEO at his own game, on his own turf, with his own playbook. Subscribe for the next breakdown in this series.